Before I start, let me tell you how I came upon this topic. I got an invitation last year to a conference titled Wer waren die Aufklärer? That is literally translated, who were the enlighteners? Meaning all these people spilling out their personal views in hundreds of treatises on how to banish superstition, to promote rational behavior, and in this respect, educate the uneducated. And I admit that I was rather skeptical. I suddenly saw myself being trapped in a conference room in an old castle far away in the deserted countryside of Brandenburg for 3 long days, listening to the biographies of enlightened parsons and such. It finally didn't come to that because I was saved by a train strike and couldn't go. But this actually caused me to take a closer look at the authors of midwifery books in Germany in early modern times. On this slide, I've highlighted the period I want to talk about today. It ends roughly with the 1730s, and this is not by chance. In 1728, as you can see, the first so-called birth clinic is installed in Strasbourg, which is French at the time, but German-speaking. And from the middle of the 18th century onwards, these institutions pop up like mushrooms in the university towns all over the German-speaking countries. By the end of the 18th century, some 150 treatises on midwifery and how rational midwives should behave had been published. They were written by university-trained men like the directors of the aforementioned birth clinics and by practitioners, that is, obstetricians, who emphasized their new area of expertise by calling themselves with a fancy French title, accoucheurs. This period is very well researched. It's usually embedded in the common narrative of medicalisation, which means doctors restrict the scope of midwives to so-called natural birth, which is the one that is not interesting from a medical point of view. They spell out to them the do's and don'ts of their work with an emphasis on what they are forbidden to do, namely the handling of instruments, such as a forceps and hook. This, from now on, is to be the sole prerogative of studied accoucheurs. But let's take a look at the time before all this. I really was surprised that when you do so, research suddenly becomes very sparse with regard to midwifery books. They certainly existed, still not in such large numbers. Until about the middle of the 17th century, physicians figured as authors of these texts. Perhaps you attended my talk last April when I spoke about anatomy as a competitive field between physicians and surgeons. I then explained the special situation in Germany, where there was a strict separation between the fields of activity of the two groups, regulated by guild law. Surgeons were not allowed to prescribe medication except for external ointments and plasters. Physicians were forbidden to treat the body either with hands or instruments. And now imagine physicians writing about midwifery. Acting as town physicians, they often were obliged to do so as they were responsible for managing urban healthcare. But where the actual handling of a birth situation was concerned, their text could not be but compilation of other texts. Their own contributions were restricted to explanations of female anatomy and references to medication that could be used to help in case of a faltering birth, namely expellants. And now we have roughly framed the period that's of special interest for us today, that is the years between 1670 and 1730. For Germany, they are commonly labeled as early Enlightenment. Authorship changes in more than one way then, as you can see at first glance here. As to barber surgeons, one may ask why they haven't entered the stage earlier. They began to specialize in other fields as early as the 16th century, like stone cutting and cataract or hernia treatment. Moreover, every textbook for midwives instructed them to immediately fetch a physician or surgeon whenever they faced an emergency situation and felt unable to deliver the child, either alive or dead. As you can imagine, physicians and their medication mostly proved rather useless in those situations. It was the surgeons who had to do the ugly work, either cutting the unborn child into pieces in order to remove it from the womb and save the mother, or, in case she had died already, performing a cesarean cut in order to fetch the child, if only to enable a separate burial of the two bodies. But while situations like these must have occurred fairly regularly, until the end of the 17th century, we hardly find surgeons who addressed this embryologia as a specific, if delicate, skill of their profession. Here you can see some references from around the turn of the century. Those who did mention it, like Christoph Völter or Johannes Fatio, vividly describe the suffering of women, both of the desperate midwives and the ones toiling in childbed. When Fatio informs us that in the 18 years since finishing his apprenticeship and taking his exam as a master barber surgeon, he had attended over 1,000 critical birth situations that called for his skills. This means a frequency of 1 difficult birth per week. So we see the legal obligation for midwives to call a surgeon met by an obvious demand for professional help. It seems strange that this situation has not been used by surgeons as an argument to strengthen their influence in urban health policy and to promote their own professionalization. Now, Johann Georg Sommer looks at all this with a physician's observant eye. First of all, in his book, Hebammenschule, that is School for Midwives, he states that many birth situations came to a bad end, of course, because physicians were not asked in time. Then he states that in the German-speaking countries, there is no appropriate, that is, academic training in surgery, let alone obstetrics. But between these two statements, he brings up something much more interesting. He says that people, even if a woman is in danger of dying, flinch from calling a surgeon because he is male. We know that husbands, different from today, usually were not allowed in the birthing room, but were sometimes called in when their physical strength was needed to support their wives. This obviously was not the same with non-family members, no matter how urgent the case. Christoph Völter, a barber surgeon himself, shows his empathy for this attitude and even partly attributes it to the lack of compassion some of his colleagues show. Not only do they put the woman on a table because they do not have sufficient access for their instruments when she's sitting in the birthing chair. No, they do so stripping her naked and without showing any consciousness as to what it means to her to lie exposed like that before them and their apprentices. The pain of shame may, even in this life or death situation, surpass the agony of birth, he says. Völter himself, therefore, never undresses women. He is careful never to have more than their ankles exposed, and he performs his operation, as he calls it, with seeing fingers. But with disarming honesty, he also admits that shame is not just a problem for women. He himself feels embarrassed by what comes to his eyes. If he allowed himself to look at what he calls this and that, exposed by the unnatural position his female patient has to succumb to, he no longer would be able to concentrate. So he prefers to work as a blind man under the women's clothing. When I read this, it made me think of Marco Aurelio Severino, an Italian anatomist and surgeon. He used corpses for anatomical research on female genitals, being well aware that certain regions of the human body in both sexes can look and behave quite differently when supplied with blood. In 1646, he stated in the third part of his book, De Efficacia Medicina, that up to then uncertainty had prevailed about particular parts of the female genitals because decency barred their exploration on living bodies. Verecundia non licere, one was not allowed because of decency, he writes. He does not state here whether this verecundia is something that's only claimed by women. Christoph Völter, however, had found a satisfactory solution for himself on how to deal with these situations. But what was satisfactory to him was not so to his colleague, the barber surgeon Karl Schott. Völter had picked Schott as his successor, and as he grew older, wished to leave to him the strenuous work as an emergency surgeon called in case of problematic birth. But Schott said no. How could he perform such things when he had never been able to see how Völter did them, who always had his hands under the women's clothes? This again reminded me of sources addressing a particular behavior by the Italian physician Santorio. There were two German students of his, Johann Christoph Kaiser from Kitzingen and Balthasar Timaeus von Güldenklee. They independently from each other complained that they had not received the instruction they had paid for from Santorio. Kaiser states that this concerned an instrument particularly designed for women's treatment, which Santorio would only apply under their clothes. Doing so, he made it impossible for his students to learn the proper use of it. Güldenklee criticized curtly. He did show it, but he didn't share how to use it. Considering that this instrument was to be inserted via the pudenda, the situation here seems to me to be the same as in Völter's and Schott's case. Therefore, I'm not sure if the unknown translator of a Dutch treatise really has a point when he, as early as 1704, already denounces the feeling of shame as old-fashioned in general and, in addition, as typically German. During the 16th and 17th centuries, shame as an obstacle to research and treatment may not have been discussed broadly, but if you turn your attention to it, you will find hidden references to it very often. As for obstetrics, all this seemed to lead quite logically to the foundation of the birth clinics. They evolved from separated rooms in hospitals where unmarried women were sheltered to have their babies. We know of such a birthing room in the Heiliggeist Hospital in Munich as early as the 1580s. The idea was not to protect these pregnant women who had broken the social code of values from harassment, but to prevent them from secretly killing their babies in order to avoid shame and humiliation. There was such a room in the Hôtel Dieu in Paris too, and this was the place where during the 17th century midwives were trained. At times, surgeons were also allowed to enter there because there was no need to consider the feelings of women who had proved being shameless anyway. According to this model, a similar ward was installed in the Bürger Hospital in Strasbourg in 1728. This is the one I already mentioned, the one that now is called the first birth clinic. As the founder, a surgeon designed it from the beginning, not only for the training of midwives, but of surgeons as well, and even of medical students from the nearby university. By giving shelter and treatment to women who came there out of shame and fear of social ostracism, and thus at the same time gave up their right to feel ashamed, surgeons created a space for training that was free from social conventions. So the dilemma Völter described, women whose shame was to be respected on one side, but also apprentices who needed visual instruction on the other. This dilemma was obviously resolved by eradicating one of the conflicting factors, and that is women's shame. Within the walls of the clinic, it could be ignored. This sounds profoundly logical, but by stitching together Völter and Strasbourg, we are skipping half a century. And this means to ignore completely an alternative line of thought that evolved then, and that set shame as a premise when thinking about how to provide adequate help to birthing women in emergency situations. The title of this paper is a quote and sums up the core of this discussion. In 1714, Franziskus Käuferle, a town physician in Kempten, reported enthusiastically that he had taught a midwife with the help of a midwifery book. He was delighted that she had transferred this theoretical teaching into her practice so successfully that she should now instruct midwives herself. This is what Christoph Völker had already addressed decades ago, that there was a lot of untapped potential among midwives because they were not taught properly. Instead, they were examined once a year by the town physician, and teaching them was limited to correcting their wrong answers. So they came into town to take the exam, got a rebuke where their answers weren't satisfactory, and left town again the same day. But they were able to do and wished to learn much more. Ideally, Völter says, there would no longer be any need for physicians and surgeons in the birthing rooms if there were learned midwives, which would be a more decent solution anymore. Of course, this meant that midwives also had to be taught how to use instruments like forceps, hook, and knife properly. According to the demands of the birthing room as a female space, there would be an accoucheuse then, instead of an accoucheur. The midwifery book by Johannes Murald shows that this was in fact discussed. It contains a dialogue that simulates the examination of a midwife by a town physician. He asked what she would do if the child had died in the womb and the mother's life was in danger because it could not be delivered. She answers that she would fetch all instruments necessary and would apply them, as she has been trained by the town physician. She would perform her surgery, Handwirkung, according to the state of the art, der Kunstgemäß. And these, by the way, are two keywords in German surgery books. Now, Murald, town physician of Zurich, was a very special character. He was a physician, but he had also trained as a surgeon and obstetrician in France, a fact the local surgeons guild was not willing to accept. There were quarrels and lawsuits all the time. But it is not only in Murald's text that we find the idea of midwives applying surgery. It even found its way into this Latin dissertation that equals a well-trained midwife with a surgeon. Last but not least, we must not overlook the fact that there were also 3 women who became authors on the topic themselves. Their books prove what has been said so far. As you can see, they all held offices and thus spoke from a position comparable to that of a town physician. Justine Siegemund pursued a clever strategy. She only referred to and addressed physicians so that her book benefited from their authority. Doing so, she even received an official printing license from the University in Frankfurt-Oder. She's playing by the rules when she reports how she sent for a French surgeon when faced with a difficult birth. But she also tells us how this surgeon wasn't able to deliver the child and how he asked for her book, only later to fail in its application. So it finally was her who brought the affair to an end. At the beginning of her book, she prints a copper plate showing how she removed a lump by tying it off and cutting it out with long scissors. Siegemund, as well as Anna von Horenburg, prefaced their books with autobiographical narratives, that portray them as a learned midwife like those envisioned by Völters. In their account, both initially read many obstetrical texts out of intrinsic interest, then exchanged ideas with practicing midwives, learning from them, but also teaching them, thus reflectively transferring that theoretical knowledge into practice. The third female author, Barbara Wiedenmann, is a different case. Her introduction immediately confronts the reader with the fact that she did not write this book herself. Her husband did it, Franz Wiedenmann, a barber surgeon in Augsburg. What is astonishing is not this circumstance in itself, but that Franz Wiedenmann puts her on the title and makes the book look as if a woman had written it. For example, he consistently addresses his intended female readers as "my dear sisters." Only once he falls out of character when he offers to personally train every willing midwife regarding the use of instruments. The midwife Barbara and the barber surgeon Franz Wiedenmann represent what Heide Wunder called an Arbeitsehepaar, a working couple, as it occurs as a phenomenon among craftspeople of the early modern times fairly often. Barbara and Franz weren't the only ones we know as practitioners of midwifery and surgery within one family. Probably the idea of educating midwives more comprehensively emerged out of the everyday experience of such couples. Here, the different areas of competence were not divided along an indoor and outdoor boundary. Rather, the outdoor world was divided into male and female spaces, defined by social conventions like the Code of Decency. Now, what happened to the idea of the learned midwives over the course of the 18th century? In Würzburg, there will be a BA program called Midwifery this winter for the very first time. This indeed had been a long way since Würzburg became known as one of the centers of obstetrics in the 18th century. As a conclusion to this paper, I would like to introduce you to the very well-known Würzburg family, the Ziebolds. There were so many of them that this whole bunch of surgeons and physicians got the nickname Academia Zieboldiana. It all started with Karl Caspar von Zieboldt, who was originally trained as a barber surgeon. He then studied, specialized in obstetrics, and founded the birth clinic in Würzburg. All his sons pursued medical education, and 2 of them also became obstetricians. However, Karl Caspar's daughter-in-law Regina Von Zieboldt and his granddaughter Charlotte are particularly interesting. Regina practiced as an accoucheuse. She obviously experienced the full appreciation of Karl Caspar because there's a story that he even gave to her the birth forceps he himself had designed, using the very words, "Dear daughter, in the hands of a woman with your qualities, and especially your hand, this instrument will bring twice as much help." Her daughter Charlotte, as a child of the next generation, already experienced the rough wind that blew against the learned women of her day. Against all odds, she finally defended her thesis. But she constantly was attacked by her brother-in-law as well as by her former teacher, who called her a mere midwife, attested her a feeble mind, and resented her speaking of surgical interventions. This is Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. The battle cry of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, "Back to nature," had by then grown influential. It entailed the idea of something like the primal nature of men and women, denying the later any mental capacities to be productive outside their homes. Birth clinics were now attached to the universities, and midwives were taught in separate classes there. They first of all learned to fetch a physician or surgeon if any trouble occurred. Shame is still discussed from time to time, but female practitioners aren't considered as a part of a possible solution. Instead, the birth clinic in Göttingen built in a hidden back door to make it possible to honest women to slip in and out of this male space without being seen. And this is why I found the period between the 1670s and 1730s so particularly interesting. This is Enlightenment as we used to idealize it, seeking out potentials, looking for solutions to social problems. And what happened afterwards sometimes makes one wonder how we can be so arrogant as to accuse others on this planet of not being enlightened. I thank you for your attention.